All right, so this video is based off of Pre-Cal 4.5 and Trig 5.5. This is a part 2 video. If you haven't seen the first one explains what the 6 trig functions look like and how to move them around and how to build and work with this chart. Okay, so let's start off with this question. Out of the 6 trig functions, I see the word sine. Okay. I also see that there's no negative here, so that means this is going to be a positive sign. So I know once I find out all this information, this graph will go over, then under. And I even like to draw that for myself, so at the end I know what I'm drawing according to all of my numbers that I find. Okay? My A, my amplitude, is the number multiplied in front of the trig function. It's 4. Okay? If this was a negative sign graph and it went under then over, you would technically see the negative in front of the 4. I don't mind if on A you put negative or positive 4 in that case, as long as you know that it's going to go in both directions. It's going to go up and down, okay? Now cycle, remember we have 2 rules for cycle. We have one rule for sine, cosine, and their flip-flops, and then we have one rule for tangent and its flip-flop. The rule for sine is 2 pi divided by b. B is a number in front of x. So this is 2 pi over 2, which reduces to pi. Next is horizontal shift. Horizontal shift is c divided by b, opposite the sign. So I see it's negative, so I already know it's going to be positive. And because I have a fraction, instead of writing c over b, I'm going to write them next to each other with a division sign. So I'm going to say the c, which is 2 pi over 3, divided by 2. That way I can do my keep, change, flip. 2 pi over 3 times 1 over 2. These 2's cancel, and I'm just left with pi over 3. Now, if you're referring back to that chart we made last class, the moment you have a horizontal shift, that is also the first of your 5 points. Okay, so I am automatically going to put on point 1 a positive pi over 3. Okay, if there were no c, let's say this was an easier problem and it stopped at 4 sine of 2x. Okay, if I stop at 4 sine of 2x and I have no c, then I have no horizontal shift. This part stays blank, or I like to fill it in with like a line or the word none, so I know I didn't skip it. And then, because there's no horizontal shift, my first point would be at 0. Okay? So, in saying that, vertical shift, do you see a plus or minus D? No. So, you could either draw a line through it to make sure you remember you didn't skip it, or you could put the word none. That means my midline is going to stay at the x-axis. I'm not going to move up or down. Okay? So, that's another side note. If you like side notes, you could say that your midline is on the x-axis. Okay? Next is increments. The rule for increments that we wrote on our notes last video was to say 1/4 times your cycle. Well, my cycle for this question was pi. Oh, I'm so sorry. I wrote 1/2. It's 1/4. So it's 1/4 times your cycle, which is pi. So 1/4 times pi is just pi over 4. Okay? So now I'm ready for my 5 points. This is probably the most meticulous part of the problem. I need to add this increment to my 5 points. So I already solidified that based on the horizontal shift, my first point is at pi over 3. But now my second point is me adding pi over 4 to where I was. So I need to say my previous point, which is pi over 3, plus my new point, my increment, which is pi over 4. What do I have to do when I add those two numbers? I need a common denominator, okay? Now, I know we have to add throughout 5 points, but if you keep the common denominator throughout, you only have to do it once. So I know you've been trained to reduce at the end. I'm going to encourage you not to reduce so that you don't have to do the work of common denominator every single time, okay? So for example, here I'd have to multiply by 4 over 4, and here by 3 over 3. So that what I'm really working with is 4 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12, which gives me 7 pi over 12. Okay? Now, if this could be reduced, like let's say it was 6 pi over 12, I'm going to tell you not to, so that I keep working with that common denominator of 12 throughout the rest of the problem. Okay? So my next problem, my next point is going to be previous point, 7 pi over 12, plus my increment. Now, because I think it's important to learn to work smarter and not harder, do you agree that this pi over 4 increment that I added became a 3 pi over 12 with a common denominator? Okay? So this could also be called 3 pi over 12. Instead of putting plus pi over 4, fixing it to change it, notice that you did that the first step and now add 3 pi over 12 the entire time. Does that make sense? So I don't have to do the work again and again. So plus my increment, which is 3 pi over 12, 7 and 3 makes 10 pi over 12. Again, don't reduce that. Wrote my numbers a little tight here. So for point 4, now hopefully the rest should feel easy. I'm obviously just going to add a 3 pi to the numerator. So 10 plus 3, 13 will be my fourth point, 13 pi over 12. And then my fifth point was 13 plus another 3 pi, 16. So once you catch what you're adding by, you're going to see that it just changes the numerator and you can get a little faster at these 5 points. I will write it out for you though. Previous point, 10 pi over 12, plus my increment, which we said was 3 pi over 12, gives us 13 pi over 12. And then my fifth point, previous point, which is 13 pi over 12, plus my increment, which is 3 pi over 12 equals 16 pi over 12. If you have the serious urge to reduce, now is when I'd encourage you to do it. Don't do it until you're done adding, but I will give you full credit, homework, quiz, and test if you keep them not reduced, okay? All right, so now you are done with the chart, and now comes the easy part, just putting it on the graph. So according to the last video, I told you step 1 was to draw the midline and the amplitude. So my midline is still on the x-axis. This is an easy problem. So I like to draw a dotted line on my midline, okay? And then amplitude means that from 0, I'm going to move 4 up and 4 down. Please don't feel the need to draw 4 tallies. No matter what your amplitude is, just draw 1 tally and put the number there. Okay? So for example, if your amplitude was 3/4, don't feel the need to draw it super, like zoomed in, like super tiny. Just draw 1 line and put 3/4 on it, okay? So right here, this is 1 point on your homework, quiz, and test, where your midline is and where your amplitude is. Your next point goes to you putting your 5 points, okay? Again, do not worry about how stretched or shrunk it is or where to draw like a 3 pi or a pi over 3. Just draw 5 tallies. If my first point starts at 0, then I draw 4 tallies. If it starts off of 0, I'm just going to draw 5 tallies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember that trig functions are symmetrical, so just draw the tallies like an equal distance away from each other. Write your numbers. So pi over 3, 7 pi over 12, 10 pi over 12, 13 pi over 12, and 16 pi over 12. And you could even double check yourself here. If your increment, my numerators were supposed to grow by 3, be careful here because this one doesn't have the common denominator. But when you do have the common, you should see that the numerator just grows by 3. Okay? And now lastly, here's the part I want you to watch first and then I'll let you draw it. I am doing a sine graph. Okay? I can only draw the sine according to these 5 points. Do not start it on where your y-axis is. So I am going to go over and over, but remember I shifted. I'm sorry, I said over and over. Over then under. So my first point is on the midline. My second of the 5 points should be the maximum. My third point should be back to the midline. My fourth should come down to its minimum. And again, you're doing that based off the amplitude. And then my fifth point should go back to the midline. Okay, so from there is where I draw my over. And then my under. And you are done with this picture. So please don't worry so much about your drawing skills. You could obviously see my sine graph looks a little funny. As long as you have the math right, I am happy. All right, so let's do the second example and then we'll be done for this video. So which trig function do you see here? Another sine. And I do see a negative, so that means when I draw this, I am going to go under, then over. Okay? My amplitude is 2. Again, whether you choose to write -2 or +2 here, I don't mind, as long as you understand that this goes 2 up and 2 down from the midline, okay? Next, my cycle, this is a sine, so I need to pick the rule that says 2 pi over b. b in this case is 4, so my cycle is half of a pi. Okay? All right, next we're going to look at horizontal shift. So here is where most students usually get stuck. Okay, remember horizontal shift is opposite the sign and there's a plus here. So I already know that horizontal shift is going to be negative. And then it is C over B. I don't have any fractions, so I don't have any crazy divisions. This is just going to be the C, which is pi, over B, which is 4. Okay? And remember, once I know my horizontal shift, I can put that as my first point. All right, moving on. This is something we did not see in the last question, vertical shift. I have a number here after the parentheses, okay, which is a -1. That means that my midline, when I draw this, is going to be down at -1. And then from -1, I'm going to move up to and down to. But we'll see that when we draw it, okay? Increments is 1/4 times the cycle. So 1/4 times pi over 2. And this gives me pi over 8. All right, so now it's time to add the increments to my 5 points. I already have my first point. Okay, now I'm going to grab that previous point, negative pi over 4, plus my increment, which is pi over 8. Remember, when we are adding fractions, I need common denominator. So I'm going to multiply this left side here by 2 over 2. So now I'm working with negative 2 pi over 8 plus pi over 8, which gives me negative 2 plus 1 gives me Right, so negative 1 pi over 8. Notice that in getting a common denominator, I did not have to change up my increment. My increment stayed as pi over 8. Okay, so I'm okay with continuing to add pi over 8 every time. All right, now we keep adding. So I grab the previous point, which is negative pi over 8, and I add the increment, which is a positive pi over 8. This is going to work out to be a really nice problem. What does 0.3 end up being? 0. And then 0 plus pi over 8. Good, pi over 8. Again, I'm doing a lot of little baby steps here for you to see in your notes. But once you start seeing this and you get a hang of it, you can fast forward a little bit. And then my previous point, pi over 8 plus pi over 8 gives me 2 pi over 8. So you should see that this is a very symmetrical graph, okay? The third point's on 0. The second and fourth are on the positive and negative pi over 8. And then 2 pi over 8 is the same thing as saying pi over 4. You see that they move out the same amount, okay? So when I go to draw my graph, instead of putting my y-axis all the way on the left, like I did last time, I see that I have 0, and then I have 2 negatives and 2 positives. So I'm going to center the y-axis, okay? So according to the list on the chart that I showed you last video, the first thing you draw is your midline. My midline is at negative 1, okay? So if this is negative 1, here is where I'm going to draw my midline. This is like my new x-axis. Okay? Now, my amplitude is 2. Be very careful here. That doesn't mean I go up to 2 and down to negative 2. It means from my midline, I'm going to go up 2. So if I go up 2, I go up to 0 and then up to positive 1. Does that make sense? And let me draw this a little longer. And then if I go down 2, I go down to negative 2 and then down to negative 3. So the highest this graph will go is 1, and the lowest this graph will go is to negative 3. All right, so now all we're missing is our 5 points. I've had students in the past that like to still draw their 5 points on the x-axis. I have students that like to draw it on the midline so that they see it the same visually every time, okay? Either one is fine. So remember, 2 of your points are in the negative. So I'm going to draw 1, 2. My third one is on 0. And then the fourth and the fifth go in the positive, okay? So we have negative pi over 4, negative pi over 8. We have 0. We have pi over 8. And then 2 pi over 8, or you can call it pi over 4, okay? Now, here's a part that usually throws most people off, which should seem like the easiest, which is just drawing the graph, okay? So, I have a negative sign, which means I'm going to go under than over. First, put your pen on the 5 points, okay? Remember that the first of the 5 points on the sign is at your midline. It usually goes up to the max, but because this is negative, it's going to go down to the min. Match up your second point with your amplitude. Okay? Now, my next point goes back to the midline on the third point. On the fourth point, it goes up to my max. And on my fifth point, it comes back to the midline. So I should draw this under, then over. There you go.